Hello, my name is Andrew Brooks. This is another presentation of Non-Linear Existentialism, Metaphysics and Hume, Logic and Relevance, or Metaphysical Implications of Non-Linear Existentialism. Here's a table of contents. Overall, the ideas that I'm trying to get at for here is to give more of an overview of what was previously discussed and also put it in the framework of divergent ideas being determinism and metaphysics. The question I have here is a question concerning logic and relevance. I'm going to define logic and relevance to show how they necessarily do not have to overlap and be implicit in each other. So if logic is the degree to which the rules and standards of a system, process, phenomena are internally and externally consistent and not contradictory, and relevance is the degree to which rules and standards and logic of a system, process, phenomena are related to and strongly express the fundamental properties, characters of that system and process, or phenomena, how do these concepts relate to the definitions of metaphysics and determinism? Do both of the ideas of metaphysics and determinism imply that logic has to imply to both of them? Do they both have to be relevant? These are questions I think that need to be addressed so you fully understand, or better understand, the ideas that are given in the physical processes that are defined for nonlinear existentialism. So a fundamental property of nonlinear existentialism, if you're going to be talking about relevance, then this needs to be discussed. So once external energy experience is sensed by the sensory apparatus of the individual is translated into internal and neuronal energy patterns that interact with other such internal patterns to produce an overall level of neuronal energy. This again is the basic tenets of nonlinear existentialism. It being a physical process, it being an energy-driven system, and also at the same time it has a feedback system. While there's an initial pairing between the external and internal energy patterns, such associations may change in order to maximize the highest level of sustainable level of neuronal energy. This is what has always been referred to as primary needs baseline activity level. Therefore, and this is very important, the primary property character goal of this process in the biological organisms that can produce them is not the production of neuronal patterns and abstractions thereof, but the achievement of such energy. So the idea is that the overall, as I've been touting a number of times, that the meaning of life is the reduction or removal of residual incongruencies down to zero. So it isn't per se the ideas, the abstractions, and everything that are related to. It's the overall context of the animal, of the human, is to get the relative residual incongruencies down to zero. So that, to me, in the theory of nonlinear existentialism, is the fundamental aspect of the process. So we have Hume. Hume's very interesting because his thoughts towards metaphysics are rather bleak. To him, as this quote shows, that metaphysics is not nonsense per se, but it obscures what is truth, because it would make sense in light that he is a deterministic philosopher. And in here, what you have in red, basically again, he's saying that metaphysics is error, and in order for science to be understood better, or to be understood properly, is to get rid of metaphysics. Metaphysics, which to me is cornerstone or paramount to uncertainty, which I believe is derived from the system of nonlinear existentialism, the uncertainty, the variance that's caused by the frequency amplitude modulation, it cannot be removed. Him, as a determinist philosopher, he believes that uncertainty in areas caused by metaphysical thinking, but within nonlinear existentialism, that metaphysics is just a reflection of the uncertainty that is created by the person's mode of thinking. Thinking is an uncertain platform. So to remove it, to make it easier for Hume to understand things, he has removed the fundamental characteristic. And he goes here again. His famous saying is, "Committed to planes, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." Again, the idea that if it's not numbers, if it's not defined, i.e. metaphysics in his understanding of it, that it's uncertain in error and should not be counted or studied, as it were. Hume, another good example of Hume, the idea of how we are is deterministic. he goes on the idea of the copy principle. And here in red you can see, and red is something that I brought up just to highlight. This was not in the original text, just to make it easier for a reader. The point I'm trying to put here is going to be that the creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the facility of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the material afforded by the senses and experience. That I think is incorrect in the way that he's arguing towards a linear, that you're basically taking pieces of information and suggesting them, overlapping them, changing how they relate to each other. But this truly does not allow for creative arrangements. That it can only be what it is. It cannot be more than what it is. So there was always a question of creativity. Creativity creates more than that is there. But for Hume, the copy principle is just rearrangement of what's brought in by the senses. But non-linear existentialism has uncertainty, which allows for true creativity. Hume's fork is quite interesting here. You have the relations of ideas and matters of fact. I won't go into this, but the idea is that what one is different from the other is relations of ideas. This goes to the idea of everything is certain because it's all ideological. It goes into geometry, into math, and the things that can be completely defined, so there's absolutely no contradictions. There's no movement, there's no change in the system where matters of fact there can be change and there can be contradiction. So this kind of puts forward more the idea that he sees things as being deterministic, but he's still getting on and around the idea that he's not talking about it in a more upfront manner. It appears within his ideas that uncertainty is present, but he only looks at it as being contradictory or non-contradictory. Experience. This is very important to his work, is that everything is based on experience, and I believe in that sensory data coming in. But again, he looks at it as a deterministic, linear fashion, whereas non-linear existentialism looks at it as being non-linear. A good example of that is that if we had, let's say, dust in the air, and it was moved around by the energy in the environment, it would be linear too, but a complex individual like ourselves, or an animal per se, is not linear to the environment because it can affect the environment. So in some way it is non-linear to it. And with the idea of fast or slower, which would be brought about by a manifold of experiences coming together and occurring at one frequency, that certainly is a level of non-linearity to the environment. And creativity, the further modulation I've talked about for amplitude modulation, that's even a further step towards being non-linear. It is brought about, it is the fundamental aspects of thought are going to be changing, rearranging experience, but experience itself is just the particles. But the movement of the particles is not going to always be completely defined by how it enters into the individual. Limits of reason, very interesting here. I looked at this a number of times. It really appears in this one that he's trying to deal with the idea of determinism, but also the idea of liberty. That in this he allows the ultimate springs and principles are totally shut up from human curiosity and inquiry, but he does talk about that there's going to be things that are perhaps from the external that you would not be aware of. So the thing is that if these internal springs and such are within the human being, that I would bring up the idea of the magnetic fluctuations that occur, that I'm supposing within the sixth layer of the cerebral cortex, is that can still be deterministic, but if because it's not linear, it's not linked to external experiences, it can in effect be non-linear but still be deterministic. But because we don't really, or as suggested by Hume here, if there's something within ourselves or within a system that cannot be detected and does modulate things, then you can have linear and liberty as well. So it's an interesting idea. And this is what I was talking about, the vast variety of springs and principles which are hid, that again, please read over this quote. It's quite interesting because it allows for the idea of liberty and necessity. Necessity meaning determinism, but liberty allowing for, if we're all linked to what's outside of ourselves, we wouldn't be able to have pure creativity because we're all driven by something beyond ourselves. And this is the idea with the idea of God. If God is everywhere and God is controlling what we do, There is no us, and everything's controlled by them, and morality is broken down because, again, it goes to something outside of ourselves. So metaphysics. I use the Lowell Metaphysics Contemporary Introduction. Metaphysics is very hard to understand, but it comes basically down to these three questions. What brings about being? Being, and I'll go into the definition later, but being is a separation from the environment. So you have a question about what brings about this separation. What is being, and how does being differentiate between different beings? So the qua through the quality of being. So those are the fundamental questions, I believe, that are inherent in metaphysics. And the other thing is realism and anti-realism. This is very, very important. Our concern is with the opposition that underlies the modern concepts of metaphysics. Very roughly, there's an opposition between ways of understanding objects of thought and talk. On the one hand, we have the view that thought and talk are about a world of objects that exists independently of human minds, and on the other, the idea that what we talk and think about, the world, is somehow tinged with mentality. So the idea is that there's a real world outside of ourselves, and as soon as we start thinking about it, that it goes from realism being what it is actually to anti-realism that is being tinged, as it were, by mentality. And of course, non-linear existentialism looks at this in a very, very different way. This goes back to this slide, just brought up the idea of what I brought up as previous definitions of being, human being, and metaphysics. And this is from Non-Linear Existentialism, Philosophy, and Certainty. So with this ones, we have the idea of quantity and quality. Quantity being what can be measured outside of the individual, and quality is unique within. And these are implicit in both being and metaphysics. The important things about this, and this relates, of course, to the energy theories that underlie non-linear existentialism, is that there's going to be being, and it's going to have quantity and quality, and it's going to be basically affected by external sources of energy. And energy, of course, is what drove the entire process. Theologically, if you want to go into why being occurs, it's going to be just energy came upon other material, and that material, through being exposed to energy over long periods of time, developed and finally developed in a way that became non-linear to the environment. The environment didn't impose a will upon that collection of material in order to create a being. It just occurred because that was a natural process through, I've talked about this before, about external and internal chaos. So through enough internalized entropy, but it's actually the entropy would be in comparison to the outside, but inside it's actually settling itself out. And this allows, in a way, for the chaotic environment that impinges upon groupings of material to actually come together and decrease the entropy in a way. So if you look at experience, the entire world outside is actually can be considered to be anti-realism, because it is a corrupting force in a way. It's a changing force. So if you allow for the internal environment to start to settle itself out, because it's in a way protecting itself from the environment, in a way it's going from anti-realism of experience to actual realism. And in this way, when we talk about metaphysics, you're getting the being's awareness of this uncertainty that it's made of. So being, metaphysics, and energy. Being, what brings about being, adaptation to energy, as I was mentioning. And metaphysics is, you first got determinate, which I believe is anti-realism, and then it goes to indeterminate, which allows for realism. So the thing is that it's kind of turning things around where a lot of philosophers have said, well, like Kant, that we cannot know the thing for itself because we cannot know experience. But what non-linear existentialism basically says, and I think this is very important, that what we see, of course, is limited by our sensory apparatus, and we don't see things for what they are. So that in itself, if it's being determined by what's coming into it, if it's being completely linear to it, you're not really seeing for what it is. But the thing is that the apparatus within ourselves that allows for the uncertainty, allows us to unlink from the determinism of the environment, allows us to actually start to see things for what they are. So I would say that the human being allows for realism to occur. Realism in this case is when all the information is within the person and allowed to move things around and adjust, and it's going towards the energy, not for what we see, but how the energy relates to one another. And I believe that's the true reality, not the individual labels that are put onto things with energy. It's how the energy relates to each other. So it's getting away from the abstractions that I think has haunted philosophy for a long time. And this is a very important slide. Uncertainty in being is perceived uncertainty in the observed being. So it's going to be looking at what's outside of itself, and being is just collections of physical matter towards, and it emits energy. So that's going to be the environment. And a human, their reaction to it, the actual uncertainty of observing being. So if the external environment appears to be very uncertain, the being itself is going to create more and more uncertainty in order to deal with that. And I think that's a kind of a very cornerstone point of view for non-linear existentialism. So the thing is that religion and philosophy, metaphysics, is the ability, the individual trying to deal with the uncertainty that they appears to be in the environment, and through bringing about more and more of their own units that produce uncertainty, that you get more and more away from the environment. And if you try to anthropomorphize it, give it a face, you can get towards the idea of religion. You give uncertainty that type of face. But in philosophy, you actually look at uncertainty as a phenomenon. Then you get into the idea of metaphysics. I talked about this in the contradiction and abstraction presentation beforehand. But I think this is a very, very important idea, is that the amount of uncertainty that's perceived in the environment causes uncertainty in the individual, because more and more of the units are being brought into play. So the more apparent uncertainty in the observed being perceives, experiencing the environment, the more uncertainty can be produced in non-linear processing elements of the observed being. Going further, however, almost ironically, this may produce more internal uncertainty if the created uncertainty can be stabilized. This harkens back to the idea of internal and external entropy. So non-linear existentialism looks at the environment as being a chaotic environment, and it causes things to break down, things to change, and the body can adapt, and that's change. But the thing is that if you've got that non-linear element within the individual, that allows for more and more uncertainty and allows for the movement, changing of energy to optimize energy. That changes and allows for anti-realism to occur towards realism, with the idea, of course, that the change is being brought about to optimize energy, which I believe is going to be the cornerstone of reality, not what it's labeled as. So the growth of metaphysics, if sensory input from the environment is considered to be a form of disorder, able to change the observer, in theory it can be overcome if the processing components of the observing being are non-linear, indeterminate to the input. A byproduct of such a non-linearity is metaphysics, or the belief in the abstract or non-linear or non-physical aspects of reality as they relate to sensory experience. So again, looking at that, holding on to the idea of uncertainty does exist, whereas with Hume, he wanted to get rid of it because it, to him, obscured things. Balance and logic and relevance. Going with this one is that we have to have realism and anti-realism going at the same time. So the anti-realism is that you've got energy coming in, and you try to label it, and then through that, hopefully, realism occurs. But you need to have both sides of it. If you've got too much of one, it's going to corrupt the other one, and vice versa. So, although there is a conflict between the concepts of metaphysics and determination in terms of linearity to external references, both play an important role in the formation of logic and relevance. Whether there being a balance, excess in the former will lead to reduction in the consistency of logic, but be relevant to the individual. The latter will be more logical but not relevant. And this is a very important idea. Is that metaphysics, because it's talking towards the idea of uncertainty, is going to be very relevant, I believe, to non-linear existentialism as a process, because that process is managing energy through the movement that is allowed within uncertainty. But if you're too far away from experience, if you cannot link it, as it were, then it can appear to be highly illogical. And a lot of metaphysical arguments, if they're not associated with something other than uncertainty. If it isn't anchored in some way, it's going to be seen very highly unlogical. But then you have determinism, that you can have logic, but it can be completely irrelevant if you do not, like Hume, link it to the more important aspects of ourselves, which I truly believe is uncertainty. So complex beings, and this is kind of goes to the final statement here, complex beings such as human beings requires logic to link internal and external references, and also requires some form of metaphysics to manage to make sense of the intervening conflicts that are produced during its formation. So if we did everything purely through determinism and the uncertainty that will come through because of ourselves and through our reality isn't properly managed, then there's going to be many things that occur within our lives that does not make sense, and it can cause the individual to, in some ways, weaken themselves or be stressed by abstractions that they cannot take hold of. So I think this is very important to say, because this has been mentioned many times in different forms throughout the other presentations, but I think I wanted to put it in this way to show how there is a dichotomy between metaphysics and determination. They are linked to each other, and they're just kind of like different aspects of the same process where you increase or decrease uncertainty, but they're certainly related. And logic and relevance, I believe, in this context, gives a better understanding, or better appreciation. So if you have any questions, please write to me. I know this is somewhat complex, and it is iconoclastic in many ways, but I think it kind of, if you ground it in a physical process, which is non-linear existentialism, with its importance towards minimizing the amount of residual incongruency, increasing the amount of energy, sustainable energy, through a hybrid positive-negative feedback loop, which is managed through an internal source of uncertainty, which can increase with the number of units brought in. It does make more sense. Thank you very much for your time and for your attention. Take care.